separate case, 4 former Taekwondo athletes filed a lawsuit last night, not just against the Lopezes, but also USA Taekwondo and the U.S. Olympic Committee. The lawsuit asserts that the failure to protect the athletes was tantamount to sex trafficking because some of the alleged abuse happened overseas. Rhonda Sweet served on the board of USA Taekwondo from 2006 to 2010. She says in the past, the organization's senior staff did not sufficiently investigate the Lopezes when allegations about them surfaced.
They didn't want to know. They tried to cover up.
Sweet says there was a financial incentive not to act. The U.S. Olympic Committee, which oversees USA Taekwondo and 47 other sports governing bodies, followed a money for medals formula in allocating resources. Stephen Lopez competed in 5 Olympic Games, winning 3 medals. That meant more money for the Taekwondo governing body. Steve McNally became executive director of the organization last year.
USA Taekwondo's name needs to become an example of how to get this right.
It is far from the only Olympic sport grappling with the issue. Gymnastics, swimming, and figure skating have all dealt with allegations of sexual abuse. The USOC could not be reached for comment. McNally of USA Taekwondo said he'd need to review the complaint before responding. But his organization will launch a media campaign next month about appropriate athlete-coach relationships.
We have to be maybe more vigilant in some of the sports that don't have that master-student relationship, that dominance built into the sport.
Investigating allegations of sexual misconduct now falls to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. That's the nonprofit created last year to handle allegations of abuse across Olympic sports. The center banned Jean Lopez last month for sexual misconduct. While most investigations take 2 months on average, Safe Sport first started looking into Stephen Lopez 14 months ago. Staff there declined to talk about the status of the inquiry, which is their policy on all active cases. For NPR News, I'm Alexandra Starr.
There was a suicide bombing this week in Kabul. Journalists rushed to cover it. When the second bomb went off, they were dead. 9 Afghan journalists died at the scene. Later that day, a BBC reporter was shot dead in Khost province. It was the single deadliest day for journalists in Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban in 2001. Bilal Sawawi is an Afghan reporter. He joins us now from Kabul. Mr. Sawawi, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you.
Where were you when you heard the news, sir?
I was at home, so I just woke up when I got a call from my editors in Istanbul. I'm a freelance journalist, and then I started doing what I've always done for the last many years, calling my sources in the police and intelligence service. Then I found out that there was an explosion targeting one of the Afghan intelligence services offices in the heart of Kabul. As I was trying to get to the bureau, then I heard that there was a second explosion, and it didn't take long for me to find out that my own colleagues were victims. So it was very, very painful.
Could you help us remember some of them?
Yes, Shamarai, the AFP photographer, was someone that I had met in Kabul in 2001 when I started working as a fixer translator. Then I ended up going on many, many different assignments with him. And to be honest with you, he was someone who was a self-made man. He was an example for my generation, post 9/11 generation. It really broke my heart because I thought about his children, about him, how committed he was. He had a chance to work outside of Afghanistan. He didn't. Then I also ended up remembering my time with the cameraman for Tilo News, because I had been with him in Kunduz province on several occasions. So these are faces, these are people with real stories, these are just not numbers. And unfortunately, we lost a generation of Afghan reporters. These were people who were the eyes and ears of Afghan people to the world. They were no more just ordinary people. They really were good in doing what they did.
Mr. Sawawi, I still have some very good friends who were fixers, translators, and then reporters in Afghanistan who are now in the United States, or United Kingdom. Why have you stayed?
I think there are many different reasons, but I think for me, perhaps more than anything else, it was the murder of my friend Abdul Samad Rohani. He was a BBC reporter in Helmand. And at the time I wrote about it, I felt like the weight of the whole world was on my shoulders, and I made a commitment with myself that no, actually, some of us will stay back. And this is the situation of almost majority of Afghans. I mean, where can they go? Can't seek asylum. There are ordinary people who really love this country, who've been here, and they are living both under the control of the Afghan government, the Taliban, or the so-called Islamic State. So I think you will find a lot of Afghans tell you that they love this country and they're staying. And there's always hope. I mean, no matter how much pain there is, how much suffering there is, I think Afghanistan has always had hope, even when it was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the civil war, or the darkest days of the Taliban regime. Ordinary people really clinged on to that hope, and it really worked.
Well, also, Ari, an Afghan journalist from Kabul, thanks so much.
It's good to be talking to you.
Sports can never be just a game for many African American athletes. It's an area in which they can succeed and win wealth and prominence, but also be subject to expectations about the roles they should play off the field. Howard Bryant, with whom we talk about sports every other week, has an important new book that traces what he calls the heritage black athletes have received from figures that include Paul Robeson, Jackie Robinson, and Muhammad Ali, to assert themselves not just as athletes, but citizens. He's named his book The Heritage. Howard joins us from the studios of New England Public Radio. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Scott.
Howard, what about those who say, just shut up and dribble, or swing and pass, or hit and run?
Well, those people are disappointed, and I think that they have been comfortable for a long time. One of the things that's very interesting about this moment that we're in is you've got this collision of patriotism, images, the military, flags and flyovers, and that is colliding with this sudden revival of the African American player, usually protesting police brutality.
And as you point out, for many African American players, questions of police brutality aren't remote and ethereal. This is something that they've known about in many of the places they've grown up.
Well, that's why this is interesting to me. I think that we see famous people speaking out of their depth all the time. And then you hear people say, shut up and play, or shut up and act, or we don't want to hear from you. But on this subject, this is an area where ball players actually have direct knowledge and direct experience. We should be listening to the athletes on this issue. We should be listening to LeBron James, who comes from a tough neighborhood in Akron. We should be listening to Carmelo Anthony, who's from Baltimore, where Freddie Gray was killed.
You direct some of your most stringent criticism at O.J. Simpson, Tiger Woods, and Michael Jordan. A phrase you use, which I admire, is greenwashed. Now let's put O.J. Simpson, for obvious reasons, in a separate category. How do you think Michael Jordan hasn't measured up to the heritage?
Well, I think it's a tough place, and I think that for the last 40 years, you had a transition from the Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos. And then when you got into the 1970s, obviously O.J. was the first athlete who really opened the door to endorsements, into the big money. And then with free agency in the 70s, ball players they were on their way to becoming super rich as they are today. And then by the time you get to the 80s, you've got Michael Jordan, who really was the guy who identified the player with commerce. And he was the guy who became a brand, as they say today. And you did not hear elite athletes talk about anything important. They did not get involved in social issues. You didn't see players get involved with Rodney King when we actually saw videotape of what took place. And it's not just Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson and Patrick Ewing and the rest of them. They did not get involved at all. And I think that the sports fan got really comfortable with that. And that's why today is so jarring.
Yeah. There are white entertainers, I'm thinking of the Dixie Chicks and Susan Sarandon and others, who feel that they've essentially been told to shut up and sing or act, aren't there?
No question. And the Dixie Chicks were one of that first examples of what we're talking about. You cannot separate 9/11 from what's happening with the black athlete today, because the white athletes and anybody else who tried to challenge what was taking place after the towers fell, they felt the wrath. It's not necessarily a racial issue only. This is a question of patriotism, of weaponizing patriotism, of weaponizing jingoism, and of weaponizing the flag, and of being able to speak. One of the people who I really admired in the book, Bill Astor, was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he continued to ask the question, who is the patriot? Can we not speak? I don't like to be called a dissenter simply because I disagree with war, or because I don't feel that we're talking about peace, or because as a veteran, it sort of offends me that there's an American flag the size of the 50-yard line on the field, and we're profiting from war and we're selling war when I'm supposed to be watching the Red Sox.
Games got patriotized, if you please.
Absolutely. And then, of course, even more so when you have the President of the United States stepping in and telling players to shut up and play as well, and using choice words for that.
Is the day ahead when sports can be games for African American athletes?
I'm pessimistic about it because I don't see that happening. I don't see any mechanism for that happening, especially when you look at colleges. You see how much pushback you get to compensating athletes, but at the same time, you don't see a great deal of interest in educating athletes. This is a question of black body versus black brain. And in the United States, the black body has always been what's been compensated, whether you can sing, whether you can dance, whether you can, even when you work manually. That's what we care about. That's the currency. And what has been difficult in doing a lot of research for this book is you recognize that college was supposed to be the place, this college experience was supposed to be the place where that began to go away. But yet, more and more and more of these athletes, whether it's the one and done rule or whether they're working at Home Depot because they blow out their knee, they're not being educated. So when black body is secondary to black brain, then maybe things will change.
Howard Bryant, his book, The Heritage, Black Athletes, Divided America, and the Politics of Patriotism. Thanks so much for being with us, Howard.
No, my pleasure, Scott.
You're listening to Weekend Edition from NPR News. High schoolers, celebrities, parents, even sports teams are copying some of the signature dance moves from the video game Fortnite. Capital Public Radio's Aditi Bandlamudi brings us this.
Wesley Holman and her husband Skylar are having their date night at a nightclub-styled video game lounge called Play Live Nation in Tracy, California.
There's somebody coming. Yep, I died.
It's a big, dark room with club music playing in the background. Instead of a dance floor, TVs line the walls with connected Xboxes. Big, comfy chairs sit in a row in front of the TVs. The Holmans have never been to this arcade before.
You know, I actually walked by with my sister and I saw people playing Fortnite from outside and I was like, oh my gosh, my husband will love this place.
Fortnite is a cross-platform game. You can play it on your phone, computer, or gaming console. The game's premise is that you enter into a world and have about 20 minutes to build fortresses and shoot down other players until it's the last man standing. It's caused a major stir in the video gaming world because it's turning casual gamers into avid gamers.
Fortnite appeals to a mainstream audience.
Joost van Derner is the CEO of Super Data Research, a company which specializes in video game analytics. He says most shooter games are serious and simulate violence with lots of blood and gore. Fortnite is more like a friendly game of tag.
It's more colorful, it has, sort of tongue-in-cheek, aesthetic to it. So for all those reasons, it's cartoony. So for all those reasons, it's much more accessible and much more friendly.
His company estimates the game has made over $200 million in March alone. The game is actually free to play. All that money is made through microtransactions. Players spend money on extras like skins, which are basically costumes for their characters, or on emotes, which makes the characters do a special dance.
I've probably spent around $60 to $70.
That's Catherine Garrett, a Fortnite player from Athens, Georgia.
There's always just so many fun skins that come out that are limited edition. You don't know if they're going to be out again, and sometimes I just feel too tempted.
She says she's never been one to spend hours on a game, but after Fortnite came out, she's now playing 2 to 3 hours a night.
And then just recently, I started watching a lot of gamers on Twitch, especially Ninja.
Twitch is a streaming service for video gamers, and Ninja, a gamer name taken by 26-year-old Tyler Blevins, is now a legend in the Fortnite world. He's a master at the game and rocketed into popularity after playing in an online battle with rap artists Drake and Travis Scott. That battle has been watched nearly 1 million times.
Holy cow, Drake plays Fortnite. That's insane.
Not just Drake, it seems, but everyone can play Fortnite. The idea of who is a gamer is expanding. Von Durner from Superdata Research says Fortnite's success is likely to continue.
It's almost impossible to fail at this point, at least in the foreseeable future, because it has all the ingredients.
It's free to play, easy to pick up, and addictive to win. And addictive to winners, like when the Houston Astros beat the Baltimore Orioles recently and celebrated with Fortnite's Jubilation emote dance. Shoulders hunched, hands up, feet thumping the ground. For NPR News, I'm Aditi Bandlamudi in Sacramento, California.
NPR News.
And this is WHYY.
Presby's Inspired Life supports WHYY. This nonprofit is committed to providing exceptional living for people age 62 and better at more than 30 communities in Greater Philadelphia, including Rydell Park, a life plan community in Abington Township, and its planned cottage expansion, Rydell Waters. Learn more at explorerydellpark.org and explorerydellwaters.org. Presby's Inspired Life, Rydell Park and Rydell Waters. Exceptional without exception.
Public media fans support companies who support public media. Get the word out about your organization with WHYY, TV, radio, and online. Call Roseanne Olin at 215-351-1223 or visit whyy.org/underwrite.
8:39 Saturday morning, checking sports. The Nationals over the Phils 7-3. The two go at it again this afternoon in the nation's capital. Vince Velasquez gets the start for the Phils, and the Sixers look to bounce back from a 2-game deficit when they take on the Boston Celtics in NBA playoff action tonight at the Wells Fargo Center.
Geico supports WHYY local news. Geico celebrating over 75 years of providing auto insurance for drivers across America. More information on auto insurance available at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
This week we found out that Donald Trump's doctor did not write that famous statement saying that Trump would be, quote, the healthiest individual ever elected to the presidency. But who did write it? Well, here's a hint. He is not the healthiest individual ever elected to the presidency. I'm Peter Sagal. Will ask who now praises famous men. Plus, we talked to Britt Daniels of the band Spoon on this week's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me from NPR. Saturday and Sunday mornings, 10 to 11, WHYY.
Mostly cloudy and cooler, highs just into the low 70s today. Tonight, cloudy with occasional showers overnight, lows in the mid-50s. Tomorrow, cloudy with some possible showers. We'll have highs in the mid-60s. 64 degrees, partly cloudy skies. At 8:41, you're listening to Weekend Edition on 90.9 WHYY.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Babbel, a language app that teaches real-life conversations in a new language, like Spanish, French, or German. Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons are available in the App Store or online at Babbel, BABBEL.com. From EBSCO, working in partnership with open-source library technologies and open-access journals to support libraries and their users. Learn more at EBSCO.com. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. Washington, D.C.'s Anacostia River has long been clogged with trash, sewage, and industrial waste. It is often called Washington's Forgotten River. Now the Anacostia waterfront is dotted with cranes and some of the hippest new developments in the city. As member station WAMU's Jacob Fenston reports, there are worries that everybody will benefit from the Anacostia's comeback.
Growing up near the Anacostia River in the 1950s and 60s, there weren't many public pools where African American kids could cool off on a hot summer afternoon. So Dennis Chestnut and his friends found their own place to swim.
So this is our beach.
We're at a quiet spot on the Anacostia, the afternoon light filtering through the cattails.
This is where we would be.
It's an idyllic childhood memory, but if you were to turn away from the water, in those days you'd see the sprawling city dump. You'd smell not just the trash, but the smoke from open-air trash fires. Ash would blanket nearby neighborhoods, even inside homes.
There was not air conditioners. We had screen doors, screen windows, and fans. And that's what was circulating through the house.
The Anacostia wasn't just a dirty river, it was a dividing line, separating the haves and the have-nots for generations. To this day, statistics are stark. In neighborhoods east of the river, the median household income is less than half what it is for the city as a whole. And for generations, those neighborhoods, the poorest in the city, were the closest to the city's biggest polluters, up and down the river, coal-fired power plants, a cement factory, gravel yards. But in the past few years, the river has gone from a place to avoid to an urban amenity.
I am up on the 8th floor balcony.
Janelle Balico is pointing up to her DC apartment just a few steps from the Anacostia. It was the river itself that drew her here. She's an avid kayaker. How long does it take you to get from your apartment to being in your kayak?
All of about 5 minutes.
The recent transformation here on the west side of the river has been remarkable. Balico's luxury apartment building is where the old cement factory used to be. A few blocks away, an abandoned boiler factory is now a microbrewery. All this is possible in part because the river is a lot cleaner than it used to be after a couple decades of dedicated cleanup efforts and a $2.6 billion sewer upgrade that just went online. But some people who've lived by the river for years see a downside to the cleanup.
If this area is really cleaned up, the chocolate city that I see here will be gone.
This is Craig Munadel. He has a lawn chair set up by the water on the east side of the river. He's fishing with a good view of all the new development on the other side.
It seems like some place that I wouldn't be welcome at. It seems like it's a culture for the upper middle class or the well-to-do, where the lower income people have been in the city and working, they're being forced out or left out.
Of course, DC isn't alone in reclaiming its river. It's happening all over the country. As money and people are pouring in to revitalize city centers, rivers that run through them are suddenly valuable commodities. Academics have a term for this.
There were some people that would call it ecological gentrification.
This is Melissa Checker. She's an urban studies professor at Queens College in New York. Her preferred term is environmental gentrification. She says there's an inherent paradox.
For historic reasons, often having to do with, various forms of institutional racism, people of color have lived around industrial neighborhoods.
And for years, people in those neighborhoods have been fighting to get them cleaned up. Now it's finally happening.
But it's coming along with this redevelopment that is going to price them out of the neighborhood.
Now this is the litter trap.
Dennis Chestnut, who grew up swimming in the shadow of the dump, is one of those people who's been fighting to clean up the Anacostia. He's the founder of an environmental group focused on the river, but he sees the development more positively. More people with means living near the river means more people invested in the river's health.
The Anacostia needs to be viewed as Washington, D.C.'s river. Not the forgotten river, but the river.
And he says he hopes he'll one day be able to again swim in the river and take his grandkids and great-grandkids. This time, though, he hopes he won't have to worry about bacteria or toxins in the water or smoke from burning trash piles. For NPR News, I'm Jacob Fenston.
Zora Neale Hurston, the legendary writer from the Harlem Renaissance, has a new book. Actually, it's an old book that's only now being published. It's called Barracoon, and it's based on a series of conversations that she had with Cujo Lewis. Lewis came to this country aboard the last ship that brought slaves across the Atlantic. NPR's Lynn Neary has the story.
When Zora Neale Hurston first met Cujo Lewis at his home in Alabama, she called him by his African name, Kosala. Though he was an old man, he was thrilled to hear it again. As one of the last slaves to be brought to this country aboard an illegal vessel, Lewis still had many memories of his life in Africa. Deborah Plant, who edited Barracoon, says that makes the book special because most slave narratives focus on life in this country.
It is so unusual. It makes Barracoon a national treasure.
It's a national treasure that has spent more than 60 years in Howard University's library, where only scholars had access to it.
Tracy Sherrod is editorial director of Amistad at HarperCollins, which is now publishing the book. She says Hurston tried to get it published back in the 1930s, but the manuscript was rejected.
They wanted to publish it, but they wanted Zora to change the language so it wasn't written in dialect and more in standard English. And she refused to do so.
Hurston refused, says Deborah Plant, because she understood that Lewis's language was key to understanding him.
We're talking about a language that he had to fashion for himself in order to negotiate this new terrain he found himself in.
In this excerpt from the audiobook, Lewis describes what it was like to arrive in this strange new country.
We don't know why we bring weight from our country to work like this. It's strange to us. Everybody looking at us strange. We want to talk with the other colored folks. They don't know what we say.
Embedded in his language is everything of its history. To deny him his language is to deny his history, to deny his experience, which is ultimately to deny him, period, to deny what happened to him.
What happened to him was horrific. He describes in graphic detail the day his village was raided by another tribe. It was a brutal massacre, and those who survived were sold as slaves. But Lewis also remembered his village before the massacre, like the day he saw a group of young girls in the market.
Oh, they look very fine to Cudgel when they walking. They sling their arms so, and the bracelet ring. I like hear that. It sounds so pretty. One day, I see one girl I like very much to marry, but I'm too young to take a wife.
Barracoon, says Plant, is not only about the brutality of slavery and its aftermath in this country, it's about the pain of what was lost and left behind.
Being taken away from everything you ever knew, never to see it again, never ever to know what became of your family, your community. That's terrifying, it's traumatic, it's heartbreaking.
Plant says that pain stayed with Lewis for his whole life.
So often in the interviewing process, he would weep, or he would be so lost in the memories of what happened to him, he could not speak.
Cudgel Lewis, says Tracy Sherrod, was a vivid storyteller. His language, she says, is not hard to understand. To her, it sounds familiar.
It made me feel incredibly connected to him because I saw patterns in his speech, words that he used that my grandparents used, and it really felt like a coming home.
Sherrod believes Zora Neale Hurston would be happy that the book has finally gotten published and that Cudgel Lewis's photo is on the cover. Lynn Neary, NPR News, Washington.
Woman is recognized as the world's greatest virtuoso on an instrument that's over 2,000 years old, the Chinese pipa. But she's brought it into the 21st century by collaborating with world-class orchestras, the Kronos String Quartet, and crossing cultural borders with Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble. Woman will be in Washington, D.C. later this month as an artist in residence with the Silk Road Ensemble, and she's in our studios now. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I have to begin with the extraordinary instrument. I don't even know where to begin. It looks a little bit like maybe in the West we'd call it a lute.
Yeah, it is related with the lute. Kind of pear-shaped.
Yep.
With the 4 strings, bamboo frets.
How many frets?
24.
I began to count.
Yeah, and with a huge tuning pick, the 4 strings, and tuning is ADEA.
Wow. And it's a new instrument, I guess.
This particular one, yes, it's new. It's 5 years old.
May I ask, how common is it for women in China to learn to play musical instruments?
Well, they're actually all my teachers, they are men. God carrying the so I think the women play starts 1990. So now it's very popular for female to play this instrument.
May I ask you to play something?
So you hear a lot of silence between the notes. That's very, very typical Chinese music. It's very, very demanding. As you see my right hand tremolo, we call tremolo, or in Chinese we call 轮子. It's like a wheel you're running. That's technically very, very
Did cleanup efforts and a $2.6 billion sewer upgrade that just went online. But some people who've lived by the river for years see a downside to the cleanup.
If this area is really cleaned up, the chocolate city that I see here will be gone.
This is Craig Munadel. He has a lawn chair set up by the water on the east side of the river. He's fishing with a good view of all the new development on the other side.
It seems like someplace that I wouldn't be welcome at. It seems like it's a culture for the upper middle class or the well-to-do, where the lower income people have been in the city and working. They're being forced out or left out.
Of course, D.C. isn't alone in reclaiming its river. It's happening all over the country. As money and people are pouring in to revitalize city centers, rivers that run through them are suddenly valuable commodities. Academics have a term for this.
There were some people that would call it ecological gentrification.
This is Melissa Checker. She's an urban studies professor at Queens College in New York. Her preferred term is environmental gentrification. She says there's an